When we talk about tone, we have to account for a very important issue with narcissists. They are insanely hypersensitive. They can say and do what they want to anyone and be dismissive and invalidating and not care about what comes out of their mouth. But when we talk to them, if we don't get it just right, they get sullen and petulant and mean and rageful and sulky and angry. We have to get it perfect. Doesn't matter what they do. And because they are so hypersensitive, they're always hearing criticism because remember, at the core, they're insecure. Narcissists they're not just hypersensitive in the face of words. They're hypersensitive in how people say things to them. So when you're having these neutral, boring, gosh, it's going to be another hot one today conversations with them, they already sense that you're no longer giving them a fight. They already sense that they're no longer getting under your skin the same way. They already sense that you're not engaging. They don't like that because their ground game is getting people in positions as vulnerable as they feel and then attacking. So if you're not giving them that, it's already stopped being as interesting. But when you're talking about such boring things as the color of the mailbox or how hot it is or how cold it is, those topics aren't interesting to you and your tone starts to become sort of flat and uninterested. You might even occasionally have a tone of contempt or disdain come into your voice. And let me tell you one thing. For all of their lack of empathy, the narcissist is going to hear that. They're going to hear even that tiny, tiny little tang of cynicism in your voice. And once again, they're going to attack. When I say hypersensitivity, it means that the person is constantly monitoring their environment for anything that even smacks of an insult or a critique. It can almost feel paranoid. So even when you think you're giving what are sort of words of concern, for example, hey, you doing okay? You look a little bit tired. They may hit back with, what? What are you trying to say? That I don't look good? That I did my makeup wrong? That I'm getting old? And yours might have actually been a genuinely empathic concern. You have to sort of comb the environment for anything that they might feel is a critique. And you often find that you monitor yourself, almost over monitor yourself, so you don't say anything that they will misperceive as a criticism. People will also say that the hypersensitivity is what makes any kind of social interaction with a narcissist really exhausting because you're often finding yourself monitoring everything you're saying for fear of hurting their feelings or saying anything that they may perceive as a criticism. Even little things, like if a narcissistic partner says to you, hey, could you bring me the water from the fridge? And you're tired and you say, go get it yourself. They may jump on that playful comment, but definitely something you might have been saying because you're tired or something like that, as the beginning of a conflict that may last all day. As a result, because of their hypersensitivity, relationships with narcissists not only can be distracting, but they can feel like double binds or no-win situations. Projection is one of those interesting psychological tells. When somebody accuses you or says things about you that really feel patently untrue or uncomfortable, instead of defending yourself, take a moment, think about it, and say, I know this is absolutely untrue about me, but it's interesting that that person is making that accusation. Projection is a tell because when somebody accuses you of something that's very untrue, odds are it's because they're experiencing it or they're doing it. So what projection is, in essence, it's basically like psychological vomit. It doesn't feel good, like when you eat some bad fish and it needs to get out of you, you throw it up and then you feel better. Well, projection is like vomiting up psychological stuff. It feels really uncomfortable to have these forbidden thoughts or ideas in your head. So you throw them up on someone else and you accuse them and say things to them like, accuse them of what they might be thinking, what they might be feeling, and maybe even what they might be doing. It's very much what narcissists do on us. The key is that we don't make them our own. And in fact, that we recognize that their projections actually give us a lot of insight into them. What they're accusing us of is precisely what they're struggling with.
So with the first symptom criterion, we have a grandiose sense of self-importance. So a lot of times we see this manifested through exaggerating and otherwise lying. So an example would be if somebody wins a competition or an award, say at work, like an award that's given every year for doing something particular, some task or achieving some level of productivity. An individual who has this symptom may make it appear that their winning of that award was more substantial than when somebody else won the award in previous years. For example, if the award was for perfect attendance, they might say, well, yes, that other person the year before had perfect attendance, but there weren't as many snowstorms. It was more difficult to get into work this year. So they distinguish between the similar awards or the same awards using hardships or characteristics that made it more difficult for them to get.
So the first one, let's talk about self-concept. Now in your covert narcissism, their self-concept, they tend to hold on to this idea of inferiority, a lot of self-doubt. They often feel very ashamed, very fragile, and they're sensitive to any setback and criticism. So often what happens is that they're set off into something and they start to suffer. They start a wheel of see how I suffer. And this wheel of see how I suffer is that they suffer more than anyone else. And that's where that narcissism comes in, and that's why it's kind of hard to identify, is because they are often that I suffer more than anyone else. My suffering is unique. My suffering makes me special in a way because I suffer more than anyone else ever has. There's a lack of regard for boundaries, and often what happens is you see this, is that these folks are often calling you all the time about how hard it is for them, how much they suffer, and it becomes very one-sided conversations. And in these conversations, they're telling you how much they suffer and how much they hurt and all these other things that they don't hear your side of it or issues that you have. So every time you have a conversation with them, they turn it to their suffering, their pain, their experience, which is so vast and so intense and is so much more than anyone else that no one else can understand how unique their suffering is. And the last one is they have disregard for others' time. So if they know that you're out on a special date with someone, or if you're having a special time with your kids or your family, they might show up. They might show up at work in a big meeting and be like, look, I'm suffering, or show up crying at your at a party that you're at or a social engagement, to draw that attention, because that covert narcissist needs to be seen as special for how much they hurt. So interpersonally, they're very destructive as well. They don't really dive deep into anything because, again, that narcissistic, covert and overt, is fear that if I get involved and if I try, I'll find out and fail. And they're often very afraid of that. So that's why that there's, for most narcissists, covert and overt, they have very, very little vocational attainment. Very little, because they're afraid that they'll fail. They'll often make claims of social injustice, and they're not really founded. So you're sort of like, well, that's their perception, but remember that lack of insight, so they only see how they're hurt and their loss.
Something curious to me, Dr. Ramani, is how two children can be raised in the same family, and one can grow into a narcissist and the other one can not have that same path. Why and how is that happening?
You know, we've talked about this repeatedly on other Med Circle series, is like how and why do people become narcissistic? You would think if it's all developmental, two people from the same family should end up in the same place. Things like birth order, you know, what the children mean to the parents. Boys may be treated differently by girls. We know there's some sort of genetic elements to temperament. Some kids are more tightly wound, impulsive, hypersensitive, the things that could potentially be more predictive of narcissism. Was something going on in the parent's life during one child's childhood and not another? So there's a lot of things that could be at play. But it happens all the time. And Kyle, it's actually one of the more heartbreaking narcissistic relationships people deal with. Because when you were very small, this was your playmate. Mm-hmm. You know, I always say that your sibling is sometimes your only shared historian. There's pictures of you in the bath together. Like, they were your first playmate in some cases. And so the idea that you will be estranged from them or not have that relationship, a lot of people become angry. They have to grieve it. Like, this isn't fair. I want a cool sibling relationship. And so it can actually be a really devastating recognition. But if you talk, it's interesting, when I've talked to people with narcissistic siblings, in almost every case, especially those who are 5 years or in age difference or closer, when there's big age gaps, it can make it a little harder because it's harder to sort of track that sibling because they're already doing such different things than you. But 5 years or less, they'll say, you know what, this kind of narcissistic coldness, entitlement, lack of empathy, that was seen in their sibling even when they were younger. But in adulthood, this is a relationship that can get downright ugly. And I don't think people are prepared for that. And now the reason you're struggling going to family events is because you're trying to avoid the sibling. And many times the parents will enable the narcissistic sibling. Oh, come now, it's nothing. Be nice to your brother or sister like you're still 6. And that can be really challenging. And sometimes siblings will have to break away from the entire family system because of a narcissistic sibling.